Thank you, guys. Well, today we begin a new series of messages called Doubt Your Doubts. For some, the reality of doubts about faith have not gone away. We all have doubts about our faith at some time. I think at least most of us do. And the effect of the unanswered questions sometimes is powerful enough to actually cause us to spiritually stall out, get in a rut, or just get stuck. And so, with some thought, I think we can come to the place where at least we doubt our doubts, and from there perhaps even take some new steps into an amazing relationship with God, or further into our relationship with God. So I want to ask you to join in just interacting with some real issues that people do have over the next weeks. And as we consider their issues, these issues, we're also going to interact with the miracles of Jesus in the Gospel of John as a way to kind of press into, there's something really strong that's being said throughout John, that Jesus does this miracle and this miracle and this miracle, and then there's this really strong stream of belief that, or unbelief that some people have, just saying, I doubt that, I doubt that, I doubt that. And so if we just took some time to look at the mix of that conversation and press into it, I think it's going to be very fruitful. And so what we have coming up is today, does science disprove miracles in Christianity? 2, is Jesus anything more than a good man? Can I take the Bible literally? That's on April 17th. And can I believe in the resurrection on Easter Sunday? Is there really just one truth on May 1st? And then Christianity is a straitjacket, followed by how could God allow suffering, and how could a loving God send people to hell? So those are the questions that are before us, and Lord willing, that's what we're going to cover. But our topic today is, does science disprove miracles in Christianity? Miracles are hard to believe in, and they should be. One definition of a miracle is an event that is not explainable by natural or scientific laws, and is therefore considered to be the work of a divine agency or of God, right? A miracle should be hard to believe in, but does this mean that science disproves miracles altogether? For the person who doubts that God works miracles, the doubts sometimes increase because of how loosely the word gets used by some folks. Skeptics hear people quickly conclude, a miracle just happened, and inside they have a lot of unspoken questions. And I kind of understand that. I kind of get that. I had somebody tell me one time, the Lord has healed me. It's a miracle. And I said, well, what did the Lord heal you of? And the guy said, well, He healed me of my cold. And he's got snot running down his nose and he's sneezing, and I'm thinking, no. I said, how can you say that? He says, well, my symptoms are here still, but I was healed by the Lord. I'm thinking, I just don't get that, And we use the word miracle real loosely at times, and I think we could be a little more careful. But does that mean that there's no such thing as a miracle? 300 years ago, the miracles of Jesus were used as proof that Jesus is the Son of God. But along came the Enlightenment and scientific thinking and method, and scientific thinkers began to ask, wait a minute, you are assuming the truth of something that you need to prove when you say there are miracles. And so we ask today, does science disprove miracles? Richard Dawkins, in his book, The God Delusion, argues that you cannot be intelligent, scientific thinker and still hold religious beliefs. So his position really represents kind of a growing cultural divide that we've witnessed during the last decade or two. There are Christian leaders today who use language of conflict to talk about the relationship between Christians and scientists as somehow as though those were two different camps, which I don't understand. And they use words like cultural wars. But it seems to me what has happened is that this has not helped us to interact and to converse and to dialogue and to try to understand, and we've kind of pulled back into our own camps and talked about the others without actually understanding each other very well. But simply because we know intelligent people that claim belief in miracles is unintelligent, does this mean that science is actually disproving miracles? our aim is to establish a dialogue about these things. And as we go through this series, we're going to look at the miracles of Jesus found in the Gospel of John. And today we're going to interact with the story of Jesus turning water into wine as we seek to answer our question, does science disprove miracles? And before we get to our question, let's kind of look at the story for a little bit and interact with the story of the miracle that's found. So I'd like you to turn your Bible to John chapter 2. We're going to start with verses 1 through 2 this morning. John chapter 2, the Gospel of John chapter 2, verses 1 and 2 to start with. On the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. The story begins with the words, on the third day. What does that refer to? Well, I saw several writers who thought that this somehow foreshadowed Jesus' resurrection, which happened 3 days after his death on the cross. To me, that's a little far-fetched, and an example of far-fetched interpretation that gives skeptics even more reason to question Christianity. I do believe we have to be careful with our interpretation. And what this actually refers to is that Jesus finally arrives in Cana in Galilee after 3 days of walking to get there. He'd been in Jericho. If you look at the map, it's down in the lower left corner there. You see just north of the Dead Sea, Numbers 1, 2, and 3. Jesus had gotten baptized. He'd gotten some disciples to follow him down there. And then he heads all the way back up to Cana, just west of the Sea of Galilee. And that's quite a long walk. And so it takes him days to get there. And so, in fact, in John chapter 1 and 2, there's the recording of what appears to be an entire week of Jesus' ministry early on in his ministry. So this explains it. So on day 1, in John 1, 19 and following, John the Baptist witnesses concerning Jesus. Day 2, John the Baptist encounters Jesus. Day 3, John the Baptist refers disciples to Jesus. Day 4, Philip and Nathanael are recruited as Jesus' disciples. Day 5 and day 6, probably he was traveling. And day 7, he arrives at the wedding in Cana, the third day of travel, you see. Cana in Galilee is to the west of the Sea of Galilee and not far from Jesus' boyhood town of Nazareth, just about 6 to 10 miles north of Nazareth. Jesus' mother, Mary, is at the wedding, and it may have been a relative of hers or a friend of hers, we don't know. And Jesus and his now new 6 disciples that he has at this point are all invited. And it's perhaps the fact that Mary has just invited 7 grown men into this wedding feast that kind of moves her to feel somewhat responsible for the fact that the wine is given out. So whatever the reason was, we don't know. We read on in verses 3 through 7. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." "Dear woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied. "My time has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now, an Oriental wedding back in that day was a 7-day feast. So we can see that it might be difficult to plan or even to pay for enough wine to provide for 7 days for everyone. So Mary says to Jesus, "They have no more wine." And Jesus says, "Why do you involve me? My time has not yet come." That interchange raises some questions and gives us some insights about their relationship. Did Mary know Jesus was going to do a miracle at this time? How did she know that? Maybe she was just thinking he'd be creative and organize an offering and go out and buy some wine. Well, we should remember Mary had some very, very powerful experiences that were miraculous too. Before she was even pregnant with Jesus, met the angel Gabriel, who predicted that the Holy Spirit would do something miraculous in her life, and she would, even though she was a virgin, bear Jesus as her child. And so she has a lot of history with amazing works of God, and so that's kind of her mindset. And it looks like from this conversation, the way it breaks out, that she probably has shared those before birth and after birth experiences with Jesus. It looks like she already is anticipating he's going to reveal himself pretty soon as the Messiah. In fact, she knows, most likely, that John the Baptist, the forerunner as prophesied of the Messiah, has already begun his preaching ministry. And she knows Jesus went there and got baptized by John, and she knows he's got 6 disciples already. So she's thinking, maybe this is the time. Perhaps she's thinking. But when Jesus says, my time has not yet come, he seems to indicate that, hey, it's not quite time yet. In fact, this phrase, my time or my hour has not yet come, is seen 5 times in the Gospel of John. And then later on in John, we read it 3 times that his time had come, or his hour had come, and then he proceeds to the crucifixion. So apparently, what we're talking about here in John 2 is that the hour of his public manifestation as being the Messiah, it's not time for that yet. And so Mary simply says to the servants, do whatever he tells you, which is really interesting. She believes he can do anything, but she also recognizes his right to independently choose what he wants to do. Sometimes, that's kind of a good lesson for us, because sometimes we get in real tough spots in life, really times of testing, and we go to God and we say, God, I need a miracle now, which is not Mary's approach. She went to Jesus and she said, look, implicitly she's saying, I believe you can do anything, and I also know that you'll do what you want to do, so I just want to appeal to you. They need wine, is what she's saying, all right? And that's a great way to approach God. How do you approach God when you are really in a difficult situation? Well, apparently she has a real confidence. It may be a gift of faith. Jesus is going to intervene somehow. Let's read what happens in verses 6 through 8. Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water. So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet. Now, who's the master of the banquet? Well, that person was the individual in charge of the wedding feast. The Jews and the Greeks and the Romans all called that person a different name, but in all 3 of those cultures, they had somebody like that. And that person was responsible to get everything organized, get all the food organized, the wine organized, everything. He assigns places to guests. He even decides on the dilution of the wine. And so back in those days, they would take wine and then they would dilute it, 1 part of wine to 3 parts of water. And so if you needed a little more wine, you put a little more water in, right? That's how they would do it. And that reminds me of a story of a coal miner who was drunk and came to Christ and got free of his addiction and became a very vocal witness for Christ. And one day, down in the coal mine, one of his fellow workers tried to trap him and say, well, don't you believe that Jesus turned water into wine? And this new believer said, I certainly do. And in my home, Jesus turned wine into furniture and decent clothes and food for my kids. So the role of the master of the banquet, one role was to taste the wine before anyone else would drink it. And so we read on now in verses 8 through 10. Then Jesus told them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet. They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now. Several points to notice here. First, we don't know exactly when the miracle happens here, when the water is turned into wine. It may have been after the servant obeyed Jesus and took some of that wine, maybe in a chalice or something like that, took some of that water, and on the way to the master of the banquet, the miracle happened. We don't know, but that could have been the scenario. And there are times when the Lord asks us to take a step of faith. He gives us a word of direction. He says, you need to do this. And if we believe and we obey and we do that, then the Lord responds. And that's not an unusual thing at all in our relationship with the Lord. Second, the knowledge, you'll notice, of the miracle is limited. All the wedding guests don't have a clue, really. And the master of the banquet does not know. He only knows this is the best wine yet. And that speaks a lot of the generosity of Jesus, doesn't he? Jesus is saying, I'm going to do something here. I'm going to take water and turn it into wine, but I'm not going to just make it like lousy wine. I'm going to make it really good. And his generosity is just overflowing. And he lets the wine flow for these folks as well. And so his disciples and some of the servants are the only people who know about this miracle. Why did he contain the knowledge of this miracle? Well, go back to the context. Verse 4, Jesus said what? My time has not yet come. So he found a way to do this miracle, to honor his mother's request, and yet keep the knowledge of the miracle contained to a small group of people. Isn't that amazing? I mean, he's handling all these different contingencies all at the same time and figuring it out. And so we read now the summary lesson statement in verse 11. This, the first of his miraculous signs, Jesus performed at Cana in Galilee. He thus revealed his glory, and his disciples put their faith in him. 3 points in this summary. This is the first of his miraculous signs in Cana. And second, Jesus revealed his glory through the miracle. And third, Jesus' disciples put their faith in him. I'm going to look at three of those three right there. First, this is the first of his miraculous signs. The words in the New Testament that are most commonly used to describe a miracle are wonder, miracle, and sign. And the word wonder just means that somebody sees an event that's just so amazing that they are amazed. This is not a normal life event. It's a miracle. A miracle, or also known as a mighty work, emphasizes that the people witness a display of great power in the miracle. And the word sign is just simply, this miracle, it has a lesson. It points people to a lesson, or specifically about God. And this is the word that John in his gospel chooses. He uses the word sign to describe miracles throughout the gospel of John. He's saying that the water turned into wine is a sign pointing to Jesus, a truth illustrated so that people would come to faith. And what we learn through this miracle then is that Jesus is a whole lot more than a strolling magician trying to impress people with his one-man show. You don't catch that idea from Jesus. His motivation was clearly to keep some people from knowing who he was at that point, that he did that miracle, and to allow others to see his miracle at that point. And it shows that Jesus' generosity creates the best wine yet, and the wedding guests have no clue that he did it. And so the Lord is unselfish, he's giving, he's very creative, so that he points a small group of people to, with this sign, to come to faith in him. The second thing that we learn from this verse is that Jesus revealed his glory through this miracle. We read in verse 11 that Jesus revealed his glory. If I could only reveal my words, that'd be great. So glory, so far in the Gospel of John, has been a way of John explaining who Jesus is, especially in regard to his state before he was born as a human being. Back in John 1:14, we read it this way. The Word, that's Jesus, before he was born as a human being, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. And so his glory in chapter 1, verse 14 is revealed in terms of seeing who he truly is, the one and only Son of God. And here in chapter 2, verse 11, Jesus' glory is revealed through this sign, and his disciples see he's the promised Messiah. And that leads to our third point. Jesus' disciples then put their faith in him. When they saw this person and his glory through this sign, they trust in him. Their story is actually closes out what is basically the first episode of the Gospel of John. And the Gospel of John then culminates with another miracle story, the resurrection of Jesus, and people believing in him when they see his glory. They see him, they touch him, they talk with him, they eat with him, and they believe in him. And Jesus, near the end of this gospel in John 20:29, is talking to Thomas, and through Thomas, he makes us aware of even greater possibilities for those of us who were not back in that day, who didn't get to see and touch and talk with Jesus. He says to Thomas, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." And what he's pointing out to us there is that hey, you may not have lived in Jesus' time, but it is possible for you to come to the place where you believe in Jesus, even though you're never going to see him until the day that you meet him. So, perhaps you're one of those folks that has not seen and yet believed, or maybe you're one of those folks who just has not seen and yet is a doubter. Whatever that situation is that you're in, let's just ask our question once again. Does science disprove miracles? Science may persuade us to say that it's impossible to turn water into wine. It may say it's impossible for Jesus to walk on the water, things like that. And may even say to us, you need to prove the miracle to be true. If you see it that way, maybe we could ask you to consider these 2 points. Number one, science cannot disprove the miracle either. Because science does not deal with the supernatural, there are skeptics who naturally doubt that miracles could be true. But science, by definition, focuses on the natural world and cannot prove or disprove the supernatural. You see? It's focused on an entirely different focus. Tim Keller rightly says, science has no experimental model for testing the statement, no supernatural cause for any natural phenomenon is possible. No supernatural cause for any natural phenomenon is possible. Science can't disprove that. Or can't prove that. Keller also writes, it is one thing to say that science is only equipped to test for natural causes and cannot speak to any others. It's quite another to insist that science proves that no other causes could possibly exist. So perhaps we should ask, must we actually choose between thinking scientifically and belief in God? Is it not possible that those two things could mix, and mix rather well? Second, there were witnesses of this miracle. As regards the demand for proof, we do have something here to consider. Did Jesus really do this miracle? Well, even though the entire crowd was unaware of the miracle, Jesus did have maybe 10, maybe 20 people there, his disciples and the servants, who witnessed this happening on that day. And if you lived in that day and you heard this story about Jesus turning the water into wine, all you had to do is get over to Cana in Galilee and go investigate and ask people what happened and see if their stories corroborate. See if the evidence is enough of a witness for you. And so this was a known story that could be investigated back in that day. It was witnessed by a number of witnesses. Now, the fact that we even read it in the Gospel of John today demonstrates even more the integrity of this miracle story. In other words, when John wrote this, people all around him were reading what he wrote, and they could prove or disprove it. This miracle of Jesus was meant to bring people to faith in him, to reveal his glory, and to be a sign that pointed them to faith in him. If you're not ready to read that sign and follow it, I want to ask you, would you consider this at least? Having doubted the existence of miracles previous today, are you now prepared to say at least that you have begun to doubt your doubts? Miracles are hard to believe in, and they should be. Even after Jesus rose from the dead, his own followers really struggled with believing it. Matthew 28:17. When they saw Jesus, they worshipped him, but some doubted. Now, next time, as we go on in this series, we're going to get a little bit deeper and press in more to another important question, which will be, is Jesus anything more than a good man? We'll look at the miracle that is in John chapter 4, in which Jesus heals a boy who is deathly ill. I want to just invite you to come back and invite you to invite friends and family to participate in this conversation. I think it's going to be really fruitful for faith and dialogue about these things. Would you pray with me? And I'm going to ask you, if you're serving, if you would just make your way to the front row seats here, and let's pray before we go to communion now. Father God, as we've kind of taken in this story of the water turned into wine, for some of us, it might not be anything that we sense is proved yet. But on the other hand, we might be saying to ourselves, well, I've got some things to think about now. God, if anybody here is in that situation, would you just help us to be diligent and push into our questions? Lead us and guide us, Lord. For others of us, we may be in situations where we're going through such a test that we really are just kind of shouting and screaming inside at you and saying, God, you got to do something, and you got to do it right now. But God, would you give us the kind of faith that Mary had that says, Lord, I really need some help. I need your intervention. But I leave that in your hands, Lord, to do as you seem fit.